It is a distinct pleasure to introduce to you our guest today. But before that, I would like to mention the occasion for this lecture. And the main reason for it is a newly established endowed lecture series, endowed by our colleague, Emeritus Professor George Kalbouss, who taught in, you have it in your program, and I encourage everyone to grab one. He taught in this department from 1973 to 2001, and he was instrumental for the health and well-being of this department on many levels. One of his legacy is the establishment of the Introduction to Russian Culture course, for which he also wrote and published the textbook. And in that course, over the tenure of his career here at Ohio State, he taught over 15,000 students. So that's quite an accomplishment in itself. Dr. Kalbouss also served in the United States Army Reserves, Military Intelligence Branch, retiring as Lieutenant Colonel in 1999. Throughout his career and since retirement, Dr. Kalbouss has also been an active supporter of all things Slavic and the humanities in the university as well as the state of Ohio. He endowed the Russian Culture Fund, this endowed culture series, as well as the Buzek Award in memory of one of his favorite students in his culture course. Since his retirement, he continues to be active and contributing actively on various fronts. He is a board member of the Ohio Humanities Council. He is a board member and advisor of the Cleveland Ukrainian Museum Archives and a member of the Ohio State Arts and Sciences Alumni Society. So, needless to say, Dr. Kalbouss is a dear, dear friend of the department and a great supporter of all things Slavic. Our first speaker, it's somewhat or appropriate to invite our own alumna from the department who graduated first with a Slavic Center degree. She has a MA in Slavic Studies and then a PhD with the department. She graduated in 2010. Her first job was at Florida State University, where she was for 2 or 3 years assistant professor, and then she managed successfully to secure another job, and she has been at University of Cincinnati as assistant professor, now getting ready for promotion. She has developed, in my view, a fascinating line of research. Her article publications and the list of her articles are too numerous to mention them all, but I will call your attention to some of her topics: challenging Americanism and Europeanism, Roma and African Americans in the European Union South and American South, representing difference, Roma and African American in film, ghettoization in dislocation in New Belgrade film, among others. I will mention the titles of her book projects. She published a co-edited volume, and I have to find it, Chinese Migrants in Russia, Central Asia and Eastern Europe. She has a monograph under contract with Cambridge University Press, Roma Rights and Civil Rights, a transatlantic comparison, and another co-edited volume, again under contract with Liverpool University Press, Migrants and Refugees to, from, and in the Balkans, Identity, Alterity and Culture. So in her early stage of I hope long career. She already has an impressive list of projects and publications. And with that, please let's welcome Dr. Sunnie Rucker-Chang.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Randy and Katya, for organizing everything, and thank you, Jana, for the very generous introduction, and for the Slavic department for hosting my talk. Giving this talk here feels a bit like coming home, and it's always nice to come home, right? I'm going to talk to you today about my current book project, which is exactly the title right now, which is still a title and work in progress, but the uses of blackness in Yugoslavia, which this is interesting because usually I give talks to rooms that are not, of people who are not Slavist, right? And so they go, okay, so you're talking about Yugoslavia, you're talking about blackness. Clearly there's a connection there. Well, for this room of individuals, there is no connection, right? There's an incongruence that is obviously natural to this title here. And so it is non-canonical and an unlikely frame for analysis for Southeast Europe. So today my goal is to shed light on this incongruence, as well as offer some insight into how employing new frames of analysis provides not just new ways of viewing, but also understanding. So Jana has already sort of gone through my work, but sort of to tell you how I got to this topic. I've looked in my previous work to explain the means of difference in Yugoslavia and post-Yugoslav space. I've written on Muslim populations in the region and their relationship with Turkey. I've written on the metaphorical image of Chinese migrants in films from the region, and I've written on dominant constructs of the nation in Serbia. In all of these explorations, I was able to locate systems that supported or downplayed understandings of self and other. But in all these projects, I was always looking from the outside. My positionality was always just as a scholar, analyzing events, history, or cultural formations. So, after decades of academic engagement in the Slavic world, and nearly a decade as a professional in the field of Slavic studies, I've decided to turn the frames of difference inward to extrapolate blackness, something that has framed me as a self-identified African-American woman in these spaces, predominantly coded as white. It is my goal that in deconstructing blackness regionally, we as scholars in the various fields of Slavic can expand our frames of reference in our studies and writings of the region. It is also my goal in this work to give a voice to those whose embodied experiences have been silenced and virtually written out of history in this part of the world in exchange for the maintenance of narratives presented by those who are more numerous. So, by the way, I feel as though I should almost apologize for using Prezi because it moves very swiftly, and so I apologize if it's not ideal for some of you, but so anyway, so it's important to talk about when I say Yugoslavia, what am I talking about when I'm talking about Yugoslavia? Because as you can see from my maps, there's three different Yugoslavias. There's interwar Yugoslavia, there's the Yugoslavia that emerged after World War II, and then there's Serbia-Montenegro that existed from 1992 to 2006, which is frequently referred to as Rump Yugoslavia. And what I'm talking about in my research primarily is post-World War II Yugoslavia, but then I get back into thinking about Serbia and Montenegro as sort of this federation that existed by looking at contemporary formations of blackness in Montenegro and in Serbia. And why am I looking at this? And partially because I think it's very important to look at these populations that are really defined by such large percentages of a majority, and to look back and see how minorities in these communities are defining themselves, or frequently inside but also excluded from the idea of the nation. And so when we talk about, and just go through these maps very quickly. So part of the reason part of why I'm looking at blackness and how it even starts to begin to be a productive way of thinking about this part of the world is we look to the idea of brotherhood and unity. And what brotherhood and unity did was it was a way to address the burdened historical past of World War II, which was really a past of historical antagonisms and hostility directed at one another, that of the nations that were a part of Yugoslavia. So in order to address these, or really in many ways ignore them and not address them at all, Tito advanced an idea of a shared struggle in the cause of brotherhood and unity, or bratstvo and jedinstvo. An idea that, according to Andrew Wachtel, would figure out how to balance out the quote-unquote brotherhood and allow for a commingling of separate national identities with the unity that communism commanded. Finding a notion around which the disparate cultures, nations, and nationalities of Yugoslavia could commingle was no small task. Given the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional nature of Yugoslavia, which included the 5 constituent nations, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Macedonians, and Muslims, and other nationalities or groups primarily with kin nations, namely Albanians, Hungarians, Turks, Slovaks, Romanians, Bulgarians, Ruthenians, Czechs, Italians, and Ukrainians. And then you also had national minorities, which this distinction of being a national minority was important in this context because it meant that you did not have numbers large enough where you weren't recognized by the state to reap any benefits, right? And chief among these populations were Roma, right? And Romani groups were very populous, but because they were not considered to be a national minority and they did not have a kin nation, they were not afforded rights in the same way. So the cause and goal of brotherhood and unity took root and bore much fruit in Yugoslavia. That is not to say that the goal of sameness in Yugoslavia was not met with resistance. It surely was. But as a motto and activation of common struggle, it was deeply entrenched within Yugoslavia. Brotherhood and unity came to gain significance locally, but became an aspect of Yugoslav global connection such that quote-unquote brothers, and here's an image for that, lived throughout the world, and then those same external brothers came to live within Yugoslavia, illustrating a fissure frequently with the way that they were treated versus the official rhetoric. And here are some images of the students that were coming to Yugoslavia at the time and were participating in the building of the Brotherhood and Unity Road, which connected Zagreb and Belgrade at the time. So, and just to show you a sense of how deeply entrenched this idea of global brotherhood and unity was, I'd like to just show you this clip from this film that accompanied an exhibit in Belgrade, Tito in Africa, which is now traveling globally, but it's looking at Tito's role in image in Africa and how it helped to really produce and expand the notion of brotherhood and unity.
I onda moja majka pokojna, kad je video, ja kad sam video crnce, ja sam se prepao. Znači odakle je crn čovjek, a ono još mu zubi onako beli. Tako da smo ih doživljavali malo čudno. Vremenom se, da, to se sve promenjalo, čak su isklopljeni neke brakovi. Čak iz naše zgrade bila je tu diskoteka jedna studentska, gde radili četvrtkom, subotom i nedeljom i onda su tu dolazili studenti i ovi naši ovdje sa kraja i tako. Taj pokret nesvrstanih je bio, kad je bila konferencija u Beogradu, pa to osnivanje, bili smo svi ono kao jedan narod, recimo.
Okay. So he ends there by talking about how they became like one people, jedan narod, right? And so this idea of brotherhood and unity and the non-aligned movement comes to be something much more, something very productive, and Yugoslavia starts to align in many ways its geopolitical position, but also its culture with its global brothers, right? And so therefore aligning itself with blackness in some ways. So let's talk about the non-aligned movement. And I will make this bigger so that it's more user-friendly. So the first meeting of the non-aligned movement was organized in 1956. It arose from the Bandung Conference that was in 1955, and then it was founded in 1956. And the Bandung Conference in Indonesia was a very important moment because it was the first time where people of so-called colored nations, which is what Sukarno talks about, came together and talked about ways for mutual cooperation and mutual ways to benefit each other. And through this through the Bandung Conference, you have the seeds of the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement then comes to be its own entity in 1961 when you have the first conference. And this portrait here, or this composite here, is of the people who attended the first non-aligned summit in 1961. So what was in the non-aligned movement? Tito was able to mobilize his position as an intermediary between the Communist East and the capitalist West, and therefore thrust Yugoslavia into global significance by way of the movement and the relationships that Yugoslavia had globally with countries defined by their blackness and brownness. Despite this strategic alignment, Yugoslav leaders did not actually prioritize race in their interactions with the formerly colonized world. Rather, it was a rhetorical mantle of decolonization that buttressed their kinship. So through non-alignment, and you can kind of see this, at least in this one image here, this is one of the images that was part of the exhibit where Tito here is in Zambia. So you can see that Tito and through Yugoslavia is very much aligning itself with the global South. And in that way, you have this inherent relationship that exists between the countries, and not just obviously Zambia, but throughout a lot of African nations. So through the non-aligned movement, African and Asian, eventually Central and South American nations had their colonizers and Yugoslavs had their fascists. And part of the reason why they were able to come together was this sort of idea that there were other people that were controlling them. So Yugoslavia was never in a state of decolonized or being decolonized, but rather they had fascists that they had to throw off in the same way that colonized nations had their colonizers that they needed to throw off. And so in this way you can start to see aspects of mutual struggle and forming the basis of the core of the non-aligned movement, at least sort of in sentiment, not necessarily politically, but in sentiment. So this logic of sentiment and the ability to posture the positions of Yugoslavia similar to decolonized states allowed the possibility of forging forward in partnership. In fact, Yugoslavia was the only member country at its founding that was not a former colony of a West European power. Even the other two European members, namely Cyprus and Malta, were both former British colonies. Thus, their choice to join the movement was based, in part, on their post-coloniality, which connected them to the majority of other NAM members. So this cultural historical difference surfaced little in the initial founding and was not subject to Tito's speeches. So he never really talked much about race, he never talked much about the differences, but rather it was always the language of brothers and brotherhood and global unity, right? And so therefore they're aligning themselves with the type of blackness and Black Africa, which you see in a lot of the writings of the time period, that was being pushed aside by other continental European powers, right? Okay, so I'll move ahead there. So in one of his speeches at the first Congress, you start to see pieces of it, but he never really truly touches race. And he says that Yugoslavia had seen many wars of conquest, invasions, and invaders. And therefore he's sort of inching towards this decolonizing narrative of brotherhood, but he never really touches it in the way. And in that way, you do sort of have an imbalance of power, but in their rhetoric, it was never one of an imbalance of power, but rather the similarities that they shared, yes. So in that way, a lot of people have argued that this relationship was really not one of brotherhood, but one of Yugoslavs elevating themselves higher than their African brothers and sisters, right? And when Tito would go into these countries and visit, it was always of someone coming to bring aid and help. Which, in framing it that way, it really sort of turns the relationship on the head in the way that it's been historically framed in the writings, and we need to think a little bit more about how Tito interacted with the global South. And was it one of brotherhood and unity, or was it one that was sort of there for other reasons and for economic and political gain in his own country? And I tend to side with the latter of that. So, but even if that is the case, even if there was an unbalanced relationship, it is very important to know that in choosing to have photographs like this and go to these countries and travel, Tito is aligning Yugoslavia with blackness in a very meaningful way. But the question is, what do I mean by blackness, right? I've said this many times now for minutes and I haven't defined it yet. So that's the film. So let's talk about what I mean by blackness. And I think that just to let you know about this research, because it is very non-traditional in a Slavic field to talk about blackness or even talk about race in this way, I wanted to just let you know what I'm using as my theoretical frameworks. So I'm using Charles Mills, who is a philosopher, and I'm using Stuart Hall, who was a communication scholar, and really left us a great gift in talking about race and the way that it surfaces in representations. So when I'm talking about blackness, I'm talking about these three different types of blackness, and in the book I'm laying them out in this way and how they surface in the culture. So the first one is physical or epidermal. And this idea of physical and epidermal serves as a basis for racialized systems of classification globally. But because race is a discursive construct, borrowing from Hall, it functions as a floating signifier. So it shifts and is dependent on the context in which it appears. I focus on the physical here to draw out the idea that individuals not burdened by blackness frequently will pretend, as Charles Mills says, that the body does not matter, right? Because a particular body is being presupposed as the somatic norm. So regarding this logic, I seek to acknowledge the embodied experience of those marked or coded as black whose place in society is defined by color line that privileges whiteness and burdens blackness. Now, but why is this important, right? It's important because this idea of a global color line is something that has been in existence since the early 20th century when American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois talked about a color line. Now, when we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, frequently we're talking about it within an American context, but even W.E.B. Du Bois was aware enough to talk about it as being a global phenomenon, both personal and communal in that regard. And going back to Charles Mills, we can talk about this idea of a global color line as being a form of a racial contract, whereby this idea of a color line in race started in the West and has its home in the West, but it's come to dominate globally. And dominate ways of global thinking and in categorizing people. So that is to say that what we might consider aspects of blackness or whiteness or black and white within the United States may not be the same within these contexts. And I think it's very important that we understand that they're not necessarily the same, because there are global frameworks, but there's also local situational ideas that define blackness, right? So those affected by a global color line in Yugoslavia and then in post-Yugoslav spaces are burdened by an inflected position in these societies, because these societies are very much defined by their whiteness, yes? And a great deal of scholarship on the Balkans supports that Balkan nations are ethnically diverse, but there's minimal space dedicated to the groups of racial others who lived and have lived geographically in these regions for generations, if not centuries. So then that's part of the reason why I'm looking at it this way. So the groups that I'm looking at here include Afro-Albanians in Montenegro. I'm going to show you a little bit about Afro-Albanians in Ultin. So Ultin, if you can see, it's cut off here, but it's this little tiny tip of Montenegro. And this group in Montenegro came as slaves in 1700 as a part of Ottoman slave trade, and their descendants are still there. And this picture of me is just from a research trip in December where I went and I talked to her. Filia, who is 94, she thinks, but she's not completely sure. She was born into slavery. So it was very interesting to talk to someone through a translator, of course, because she speaks Albanian, but to talk to her and hear about her experiences growing up. And then she is related to Rizo Šurle, who has sort of come to be very well known in Montenegro, and he's sort of their quintessential, I don't know how to explain it, he is the embodiment of what an ideal Afro-Albanian. He had a very Yugoslav experience. He was a partisan. He fought in the army. He spent time in Zagreb. He spent time in Belgrade, and so that's Rizo Šurle, and then his family is still there, and then he has other descendants. And so what I've been doing with the Afro-Albanians in Ultin is I've been talking to them to learn about their experiences, and then I'm hoping to go back in the future and talk to what would be the fourth generation, just to hear about or fifth generation at this point, to talk about their experiences and how they are seen and viewed in Montenegro and spaces that are very much defined by their whiteness, and how this population continues to be Montenegrin and simultaneously not be Montenegrin. And what does that mean? Yeah. So in addition, I'm looking at Romani populations, a group frequently described as having Indic origins, but whose tenure in the region spans centuries. And part of the reason why I'm looking at Romani populations is because within local parlance they are considered to be black. One of the things that drew me to this research was a couple of personal experiences with Romani people where they say, well, we're the same. And I say, okay, well, let's dig through this a little bit more and figure out what we mean by this. And part of this are these global formations of race and the color line, right? So Romani populations I'm looking at, and this is when I'm looking at the epidermal and physical, that's when I'm looking at primarily those populations. The second form of blackness that I'm looking at here is situational. And this situational form of blackness is where you have the demarcations between Eastern blackness and Western whiteness. And looking at it, and the situational whiteness is saying that there is an idea that privileges the West, and therefore this Western privilege within European spaces makes it akin to having this European whiteness, whereas in the Balkans you have this burden by blackness. And if I can get this to pull up, you can see this in a lot of reporting about the Balkans, where there's always something wrong, there's always some trouble there. It's always burdened by a past that is just waiting to creep up, right? And this is something that I like to actually use in class, and it's from 2013, I do believe, but you could do this. You can just Google Balkans and pretty much any news source even to this day, and you will see that it's burdened by being different than Europe proper. And then questions remain is this Europe? Is it something else? Is it liminal? And this is the sort of situational blackness that I'm talking about. And finally, the last type of blackness that I would like to talk about is this type of blackness that is revolt, embodied in style and soul. And this is a metaform of blackness that has its roots in the 1960s and 1970s that is triangulated through the African diaspora in the Caribbean, Western Europe, and the United States. And this is where the mantle of blackness becomes a blackness of pride and mainstream black culture and has become a form of cultural traffic, meaning that this type of black cool has become a type of cultural capital that is really informing contemporary culture and pop culture globally. So, but even to look back at Yugoslavia, you can see instances of this happening in the 60s and 70s. And what I have here are some clips, some music clips actually of bands that came to Yugoslavia from the students that studied there. There's a really interesting kind of fun phenomenon that happened during the time where students were coming over to study in Yugoslavia, where they were forming rock groups, right? And so I wanted to just show you this one in particular, if it will play. And this is an interesting one because it's sort of a montage where it's cutting from contemporary to past, so where he was a student in Yugoslavia and he had his own band, to a contemporary time where he has actually come back to Yugoslavia, or to Serbia now. And I won't make you listen to Steve Huntington for too much longer, but he's an interesting case, right? He's definitely an interesting case to look at. Let me make this a little bit bigger and go back here. Also among this is you have Eddie Decking and Dusan Golubowski with Bobby Smith, and then Jamahiria, which is the Green Wings, and they were also a part of these students that were coming and becoming pop cultural phenomena. Now I focused and I showed you Steve Huntington there because he's a very fascinating case. He left in 1991. He was one of the earliest groups of students to come in the early 60s, and he stayed and left in 1991 because of the wars. But then he came back because he says that he feels that he's such a Yugoslav that he needs to come back. And so it's regular that you will see him on TV, giving interviews, playing songs. He has motivational talks where he talks about being a good person, all of these things. But to show you how strong and how much of a force this idea of global brotherhood and unity was, that someone like Steve Huntington is going to come back now. And apparently you can see him walking around in Belgrade. I have not seen him yet, but apparently you can. I just need to go back. Okay. So, sorry. So that is in many ways how I'm looking at the Yugoslav engagement with blackness. But to really get a complete picture, I think it's really important to look at contemporary forms and post-Yugoslav engagement with blackness. And I'm looking at Serbian engagement with blackness, and part of the reason, or not really partly, but the majority reason why I'm looking at Serbia and engagement with blackness is because I see Serbia as being the most immediate successor state of Yugoslavia. And there's a fair amount of work that has been done on this that says that Belgrade was the capital of Yugoslavia, it's the capital of Serbia, yes, but it's more than that. It's a sentiment, it was that an affiliation that it still has with Yugoslavia. So in looking at post-Yugoslav Serbian engagement with blackness, you see this idea of Serbia being a ghetto, right? And this is part of what I worked through in the paper on filmic images of the ghetto in Serbia and African-American images of the ghetto. So in the years leading up to the demise of Yugoslavia, most of the foreign students left, and with their departure, the association that the post-Yugoslav republics had with the rest of the world varied based on their geopolitical aspirations and constructed views of them by the outside, right? So their ideas and association with the rest of the world was informed as much internally as it was externally. So in this setting, the Western and more prosperous republics worked to reclaim a European heritage that they believed had been severed through decades of their long relationship with Yugoslavia. Slovenia, and we know this history, right? Slovenia became integrated into European systems, including NATO, and Slovenia joined the Eurozone in 2007 and held the EU presidency in 2008. Croatia was a few years behind Slovenia and achieved NATO status in 2009. It was the most recent, and I like to add perhaps the last, I don't know, country to join the EU in 2013. Serbia and Bosnia, quite the contrary, have found themselves in very different situations vis-a-vis their relationship with the West. Bosnia remains a protectorate of Western institutions in many ways and remains under the watchful eye of UN peacekeepers on some level. The High Representative and the territory of Brčko has an administrative structure unlike the rest of the country. Serbia functions outside of European systems and has been in a long line for European Union membership. So the distance that Serbia has from the West and Western institutions has precipitated an introspective approach culturally and the recognition of its situational blackness. Instead of turning away, however, Serbia's geopolitical position and cultural embrace has been to turn away from the normalizing frames of Europeanness and opt with a re-engagement with the non-aligned movement in a similar way to the Yugoslav position of the 1960s through to the 1980s. One way in which this engagement surfaced was in cultural products, and film in particular was instrumental in illustrating Serbian marginality. And I tried very hard to just sort of show you some images where you have individuals very much being framed by their settings of steel and metal. These shots where you can see the very high skyscrapers. This guy is obviously a rapper in the basement, and so you have these very, what I would consider to be universal images, hip-hop, sort of global hip-hop cultural images, but then also ghetto films, as it were, as a genre, if you can call them a genre, which some people argue you can. Anyway, and these individuals sort of being framed, where there's not very much life going on, there aren't very many opportunities, and more than the individual being framed by themselves, they're being framed by these very cold surroundings. And then I just put this here because I thought when I started preparing this presentation, I put in, I did a search for Brotherhood and Unity, and I came up with this Brotherhood and Unity, the Black Ring Crew, which is a hip-hop group that talks about their ghetto and how they are very much tied to their ghetto. And it's the imagery, and even this boombox is something that's very much, from the origins of early hip-hop culture. Anyhow, okay. So the tropes of the ghetto film, the urban setting, this destroys and depersonalizes individuals. So in the Serbian context, the ghetto film represents the ghetto that Serbia had become in the post-1999 or post-bombing setting that rendered interaction with the outside minimal. The significance of Belgrade and the regular groups of international students were a thing of the past. Serbs did not interact with outsiders and had no reason to believe that black and brown people were the same as them. So this idea of global brotherhood and unity had sort of been cast aside and was very much a thing of the past. That is why in 2010, when the program World in Serbia, the World in Serbia program was announced, it was telling of the future that Serbia envisioned. It reimagined Serbia's position in the non-aligned world, and with it the prominence and global significance that accompanied such a position. It also invigorated a relationship with blackness that Serbs had not envisioned for at least a generation. Blackness and its associations came to be a language of revolt in response to its positioning. So whereas it was a language of oppression, it became to be, I argue anyway, it became to be a form of revolt, because it's saying, if we cannot be a part of these European systems, we'll look to a past where we had a more elevated position globally, and it was through our black and brown brothers that we had this important or elevated global positioning. So since the introduction of the program in 2010, and I should just say that these images here are announcements for the World in Serbia program that has been going on since 2010, where students from non-aligned member countries and non-aligned observer countries are giving free scholarships, housing, healthcare, and a stipend to study in Belgrade, which sounds a lot like what was happening from the late 50s to the early 80s, right? And there are many ways to see this, obviously, but I see this as a direct line back to this imagined past, or this past that existed, and this need to reclaim that mantle of that position Serbia as being really much more, or sort of the leader of the movement, shall we say. So they've come from 53 countries, and they come to study in Belgrade, no other cities right now, and some plan to make Belgrade their home as others did in generations past. This program has genuinely revolutionized Serbian spaces. One of my informants, and I should say that I'm doing interviews as part of this research, one of my informants from Kenya, who was among the first group to study in this new program, told me that when he arrived in Belgrade, the Serbs with whom he interacted mused that black people, for them, were only football players or rappers, which in and of itself speaks volumes of the movement of black culture as a form of cultural traffic. But he was preparing to believe, he could say with confidence, that most people in Serbia, in the major towns at least, had seen and interacted with a black or brown person. The goal was that these individuals, as part of the World in Serbia program, will return home and promote Serbia in the same way that students who studied in Yugoslavia did in generations past. This, of course, will be a natural outcome. However, the students in Belgrade are not just changing the face and culture of Belgrade and becoming willing ambassadors once they return home. They are changing Serbian internal associations and proximity to blackness once more. And I'm ending with that, but I want to show you this final video, if it will play. I should pause it. So these are students who have studied the course of learning Serbian well enough to be able to graduate and then go into studying in university. And this is a very typical song about Belgrade. And I'm going to stop it there. Okay. So thank you.
I believe Sunnie is willing to entertain questions, and but would like to mention an important part, and everybody is invited. We have a reception after that, the lower level of faculty club. Please join us.
Yes, please.
Dr. Rucker-Chang, specifically in regards to the World in Serbia program you sort of ended on talking about, do you see this as a means of Serbia sort of trying to achieve like a geopolitical status in the world?
Absolutely.
So, and do you think, if it's focused on Africa, do you think they can realistically hope to compete with Chinese money in Africa at this point, or is it just sort of like or is it just not related at all, or how do you see that?
So, I should say that I study culture primarily, right? And so in terms of competing, I don't think that there's any competition to be had in that regard. I should also say that there are significant Chinese investments throughout the Balkans, right? And so I don't see that Serbia is trying to compete directly with China. What I do see is Serbia recognizing that their position is not going to be similar to Croatia or Slovenia, and so they're enlivening this past. Okay. And it's fascinating because the city looks very different. It looks very different, and people's attitudes are very different. And so it's happening. And it's also a way for Serbia to realistically engage globally, not just for the students that are coming, but for their own citizens that have been very much distanced from the world, as it were. Yes. So. No competition, but yes, in terms of its global competence. Okay. Yeah. Whether or not it'll be successful remains to be seen, but it's significant. Yes?
So you've commented about how the sort of, attitudes of Serbians are changing in relation to blackness, right?
Yeah.
And so do you see that this might trickle down to other sort of ethnic minorities that are coming through? I'm thinking mostly of Middle Eastern migrants or refugee seekers, right? So coming through ultimately on their way to maybe other EU countries, but do you see that there maybe is a better welcome there than other places in the Balkans?
So this is a really interesting question, and had you asked me this a couple of years ago, I would have had a different answer. So I did a presentation at the height of the migrant crisis, right? And there was this image, and I don't know if you saw it, of a Serbian soldier holding a Syrian baby, and he was this sort of image of tolerance and openness. And even Vučić at the time, who was president, yes, he would say, we know what it's like to be refugees. And because we know what it's like to be refugees, we're not going to turn these individuals away. So for a moment, it really looked as though there was this sort of tolerance that was being shown. But in many ways, from a practical matter, what have you, no, I don't think that it's going to have an impact. However, there are many Muslim students that are there. As a matter of fact, in this regard, my first interview was with someone from Indonesia. And a woman, she wore a hijab. And so it became a very interesting question that I had to ask myself with what did I mean by blackness? Because she's obviously very different. She's obviously marked and coded as different. And so it really made me think about that. So in some regard, yes, their tolerance, the difference, she walks around in hijab, you know, without any issues according to her anyway. But in other ways, no, because there's this sort of hierarchy of people who are coming. But I will say, just this is not, you know, this is personal commentary more than anything. I've seen the most refugees walking around and sort of just living their life, being integrated, going to school in Belgrade than I have in any of the other places that I've traveled in the region, which is just sort of pure anecdotal observation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, Sunnie, hi. Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way this is related to education in two questions in particular. One, I know that there is a need for Serbia to show, if they're interested in EU accession, they need to show reform of the educational systems, and whether bringing in whether global Serbia or with the world in Serbia is part of that educational reform. But secondly, what happens to these students when they finish? Is there any program that allows them to stay, or do they just go home again?
Okay, so the first question, I don't know if this is part of their sort of getting their ducks in a row to become EU members. I don't know, but that's something that's a really interesting question that I should look more into. In terms of the students and what happens to them when they finish, I had an interview with a student who was on his way out. He was the one that I paraphrased at the end of my talk there. They kick them, they're gone. They have to leave. There's no mechanism for them to stay, which is quite a bit different than before, because some of my other informants were from generations past who managed to stay, they got married, et cetera, but he said, I finished. He finished his medical degree, so he was a doctor, right? And he said, I told him I can't be finished, I still have to do my resident, I have to do some research or something. So he was able to have an extension of some kind of funding for that, or his visa. He had to pay for all of his research. But then he had to leave, and he was very much wondering what he was going to do, and now he's back home and does not know where he's going to wind up. Yes. So the goal is, and the other thing along with that is that he said that when he first came, there weren't really any mechanisms to even have them really be there and accommodate them. So on the surface, it's this wonderful program that is very global and international, and but on the sort of the details of it are somewhat questionable. Yeah. Yes.
The question about refugees made me or sort of sparked this thinking. There might be there's a sort of role reversal in some parts of the Balkans involving Serbs that might make for an interesting comparison. I'm thinking of Kosovo, and in particular a town like Mitrovica, where the Serbian side really looks third world-ish.
Yes,
compared to the Albanian side, and so the Serbs as sort of demoted citizens in a sense in Mitrovica might make for an interesting comparison with. I mean, I don't think they aren't black in the sense that you've been talking about,
right.
but they're second class.
That's
situational blackness. Yes, that would be the situational blackness.
Right.
And this is a really interesting point, and I think that it would tie into this very well. I should also tell you that along with and I didn't talk about it because it's not necessarily completely relevant to this, but along with the world in Serbia, there's the Serbs in the Serbian region. So you may have noticed that there's Serbs that are coming primarily from Kosovo to study in Belgrade right alongside with those other students that are coming from the countries. Parallel programs, but very similar, yes.
Andrew?
Yeah. You said you had also touched on researching a little bit of some Romani issues as well. And I would be curious how you would characterize their experience compared to some of these, maybe to caveat off of Randy's point about the migrants. And you said anecdotally you felt like there were more migrants moving freely, and so I spent the last year living in Bucharest, and the Romani people are just, I don't think that at least in the current generation of Romanians who are ever going to change their mind about the Romani people. I think there's just like deep-seated hatred, and I'm curious what you, even anecdotally, what you saw in Serbia.
So one of the things that I try to do in my research on Roma, because actually the book that hopefully will be out by the end of this year is actually looking at civil rights in Roma, and comparing civil rights and Roma rights. And I think that irrespective of the way that people feel, sort of in the dominant groups and societies feel about Roma, there are different people. Roma are in different social registers, right? And so because they span various socioeconomic strata, it's very difficult to sort of generalize. Thank you. It's very difficult to generalize about Roma, right? And it's really important. I think that when we ask these questions, when we have these conversations, that we continue to see them throughout society in various respects. Yes.
And I have a couple of questions. One was, when we used it even now in the discussion, the situational blackness here. And I think with your different uses of blackness, that was very interesting, but I think what you are doing also is totally changing perspectives, because you're moving the centers, the peripheries, so that's what you are doing, right?
Yes.
And the other one is, you could explain a bit more the whole idea of the non-aligned movement there, how all the others were shaking off and pushing away the former oppressor, but the Serbs thought they were fighting or had to push away Nazism. I mean, that was very different.
Yeah,
I mean, the history of fascism or Nazism in the Balkans and Yugoslavia was minor. I mean, it has nothing to do with the colonial legacy.
Yes.
So how are they
equating
equating all this? I mean,
well, it's not necessarily. So this is really interesting. So I've gone back and I've looked at Tito's speeches, particularly from the '61 conference, and there's been some work on this about performing solidarity. There's an article that just came out last year by a Ohio State grad, actually, it's an act, really. But to say that it's an act, and to say that they're working to somehow align themselves with these marginalized people in the global south and people who are in the process of decolonizing has not been an accepted narrative for a very long time. And so in order to take that point of view, which I do, it means you're going to get pushback, right? And so I personally don't see that as being the same. But in a lot of the writings you will see they had their colonizers and we had our fascists, and therefore we can come together in this sort of idea of global brotherhood and unity. So it's a way, it's an entry point for Yugoslavia to be a part of what happened in Bandung without having to recognize that there are going to be differences in power, differences in position that make them very different than the people who are their global brothers. Does that answer? Hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
I had a question, but as follow-up question about Romani communities.
Yes.
So, in your research, how do you see how exactly, in what ways that blackness or positionality of blackness is assigned to Romani communities?
So, right now, in terms of the Romani communities, there is this idea that is productive in society, that, and at least within Serbia, that they are black. As a matter of fact, in the chapter where I start talking about epidermal blackness, I talk about this film called Grasslands, which is a documentary about Gucha, and there are two boxes for musicians to register. One box is for black musicians, and one box is for white musicians. So in terms of it being a productive use of the term black, it is there, and people, I've had conversations, again, a lot of this research and coming to actually doing more with this and making it a scholarly endeavor has been with conversations with people, right? So I've had conversations where people are like, oh, you're black, I'm black, and I'm like, wait a second, what? What do you mean you're black and I'm black? And then we have these conversations, and for some of these people, this is really how they define themselves. There's a phenomenon of the white gypsy versus the black gypsy, or white Roma versus the black Roma. And so it's a way of defining themselves, and it is frequently epidermal or based on the way that an individual looks.
That's religion also, because they are Muslim Roma and Christian Roma.
I don't know. That I do not know. I haven't really entered into conversations about religion specifically, but that's definitely something that I should look to as I work through this. I should be taking notes.
Any other?
It's being recorded.
Fair enough. I don't like to watch myself, but yeah. So I'll write things down later.
Yes, it's maybe a little bit tricky question, but you talked about the race and how usually when you make presentations, they are more like in line of understanding of other groups, but not in kind of Slavic departments, etc. So, just your opinion, how do you think the race is so often ignored on the Slavic departments or excluded, or how actually some ideas or even post-colonial theories can actually erase this focus on race as well?
Well, see, the part of what we have to do is we have to use the other theories to create our own, right? And if you're interested in this, Catherine Baker from University of Hull just recently came out with a book last year about race in Southeast Europe, and is it a productive term? Can we even use race? And I say, what we have to start talking about are power structures and differentials and positions within society, and then we can have different ways of talking about race. Because in an American context, and I get this all the time when I present, you're an American, that's why you're talking about race. I'm like, no, it's not why I'm talking about race. I'm talking about race because we're talking about differences of power, differences in position, and that's why I have these three different categorizations of race, which may change as I continue to write, but that's where I'm working with. And if we can reframe the conversation and make it local, then we have to start talking about race. But part of the reason also why there has been a reluctance to engage in this idea of race is because the conversations that we were not colonizers, and we, therefore, because race is a natural outcome of holding colonies and being an empire, we can't have race. And therefore, and I've had this told to me a number of times, and so if we say, it's not a matter necessarily of being an empire, but it's a matter of this global engagement with intellectual flows of information, and that's part of the reason why I use the racial contract, then you can see that clearly, if you benefited from these scholarly flows, then you also somehow internalized or became privy to these same types of discussions and formations of race. And that's why. Very long 20-minute answer for a very short question, I apologize, but that's why. But that's why I'm here, and there's many more of us, not many, but there's more of us to start this conversation and push it a little bit forward. Hence the innovation, right, or innovative ways.
And it is embedded in power relations, which carries its own legacies and complexities.
And I'm happy to talk to you about that more if you would like to.
Any other thoughts? Pasha?
In Tito's writings, does he ever, when he's talking about the brotherhood, does he ever use it as a slam against with what was going on in America with the civil rights movement? In terms of, see how much more generous we are, how much more brotherly we are, whereas in the United States.
So I haven't seen that yet, and I know that that's the case in Soviet, definitely in the Soviet discussions of race. Within Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia really played this intermediary between East and West, you don't really see, or East and West is not exactly precise, but that's how it's frequently discussed. So I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen any discussion about the United States is so awful the way that they treat their people. It wasn't this sort of, we are a society that is race blind, and therefore you should come and be in this country in the same way that it was in the Soviet Union. I've not seen it. It doesn't mean that it's not there, but I haven't.